gentlemen. My name is John O'Sullivan. I'm the president of the Danube Institute, and I'd like to welcome you all to this retrospective examination of the Salazar, the revolution rather, against the Salazar government in 1975. It's quite a long time ago, though I have to say, it doesn't seem long to me because actually it was one of the very first international events of major importance that I remember dealing with as a journalist on the Daily Telegraph in London. I was not the reporter who was sent to cover it. That was a very distinguished writer called Colin Welsh, who wrote a brilliant analysis of what was happening as it was happening. But I wrote some editorials on behalf of the Telegraph in that time, and of course it was an event that was a combination of the important, the historic, and the romantic. The title of this event, the Carnation Revolution, 50 years on, tells you that. But it was undoubtedly a moment in European history which had echoes of both recent previous moments, the Hungarian Revolution for one, but also much older ones, the revolutions of 1848 and so on. Now, was that feeling at the time later justified, or was it justified at the time? Well, that's one of the questions that will be discussed here by our distinguished group. We have two biographers of Salazar, one Portuguese, one British. We have an editor. There are two editors too. Three if you count me, because we have the editor of this magazine, a Portuguese magazine, Critics Axi. I'm not sure I can pronounce it with a decent Portuguese accent, and we have the editor of the European Conservative, Mario Fantini, who has done a remarkable job in inventing his own magazine and producing it. And I think lately he's opened the eyes of Europeans and English-speaking peoples to the importance of the political thought of Spain and Latin America, something which obviously is a contribution to the world, but is something which most people in the English-speaking world and Western Europe are not really aware of. At least they're not aware of its richness and complexity. So I think that's a service to civilization. Mario, thank you. The person I haven't yet mentioned, I've mentioned him as a biographer, namely Tom Gallagher, Professor Emeritus of Politics at University of Bradford. But I think since his retirement, he has actually developed a new career, not simply a career as a writer. I mean, he's got a new book out on European political leadership, but he's become a force on Twitter as well, or X it now is, a force to be reckoned with if you're an opponent, and to be, as I am, not an opponent but a supporter, to be relished and enjoyed. Having said these things, I myself got a few things to say on the platform, perhaps, but for the moment, I will hand over to Mario Fantini, who is going to act as moderator on this occasion. Mario, the floor is yours.
John, thank you, as always, for your kind and generous comments. Good evening, good afternoon, everybody. I want to abuse my role as moderator by actually delivering a short introductory statement. Revolutions, frankly, fascinate me. They always have. On the one hand, I recognize that there's the little adolescent in me that is fascinated by disorder and chaos, the thrill of the uncertain, not knowing what's going to come after you've disrupted a system or a political order. On the other hand, the slightly more mature side of me recognizes that it's a problem, it's dangerous, and I'm consistently horrified by the disorder that revolutions almost always inevitably bring to a society, a political community, and the bloodshed that is produced. For those of you who don't know me, I myself am you could say, the grandson of a revolution, the 1952 national revolution in Bolivia. Not really on anybody's radar screen. That's when my grandparents on the maternal side and my mother and two sisters fled in exile to escape the mobs that were, at that moment, trying to get vengeance on anybody who collaborated with the ruling three mining families of Bolivia. And my grandfather worked as the editor-in-chief of one of the newspapers run by one of those families. So revolution is also, perhaps you could say, in my blood. I'm not saying anything really new or original here when I point out that there have been good and sometimes bad, usually bad revolutions. In a very simple way of viewing things, French Revolution, bad. American Revolution, good. Latin American revolutions, generally bad. On the whole, pretty bad. Now, we won't get into the typology of revolutions tonight. We could do that perhaps after the event. But what I'd like to do is, with these inartfully articulated or expressed statements and opening lines, is simply provide a bit of banter against which our three esteemed speakers tonight will talk about. And they will illuminate, I hope, one of the most eulogized, one of the most praised and whitewashed revolutions of the past half century, the Carnation Revolution, which took place 5 days ago, April 25th, in 1974. 5 days ago, I don't know how many of you noticed in the international media and the press, the Portuguese and the international left was jubilant. There were speeches and tributes. This is why I think our good friend Jaime Nogueira Pinto had to escape his country just for a few days because he was just over the top. There were remembrances, there were products being sold. I read several overly sentimental editorials by people who weren't even alive during that time, but who praised the symbolic act of putting the carnations into the rifles of the soldiers who basically led the revolution. All these people today in the international left applaud the revolution for having brought democracy not just to Portugal, but to all of its former colonies, and they sing triumphantly of a post-Salazar Portugal, a Portugal that finally, after 75, 80 years, entered the modern world, as if nothing had happened for all those decades. But tonight, in this safe space created by the Danube Institute and the European Conservative and all the other wonderful initiatives that Hungary and with its genius has found worthy of pushing forward, recognizing that safe spaces in the West are fewer and fewer. In this safe space tonight, we're going to ask, I hope, at least I am, going to ask some politically incorrect questions about the Carnation Revolution, about what it was revolting against, and about what the legacy of that period was. Was the Carnation Revolution something admirable, something to celebrate? Did it achieve all the things that the people back then said that it would achieve? What concretely was achieved? Because a cursory examination of the historical record points to basically 18 months or more of unrest and sniping and factionalism, machinations and plottings. Good stuff for a novel. I sometimes wonder if the international left grasps what exactly the Carnation Revolution means to people around the world. I think they grasp onto it as a beacon of hope because a year earlier, remember, September 11th, 1973, the international left suffered a massive defeat in Chile. So perhaps 74 is so important for the international left and all progressives because they have the pain of what happened in Chile a year before, so they have this as a symbolic thing. We have to celebrate it. We have to keep its memory alive. We have to point out that the Carnation Revolution was a watershed moment for progress and for all those of us who love democracy. I'm not sure it's that simple. So tonight we'll address these and probably many other questions and topics. And we'll have a chance, I hope, towards the end to open it up to the audience. Perhaps some of you have questions to ask of our three invited guests. And perhaps we'll find a new way to look at this Carnation Revolution. So I think I'll introduce each of you now, and then we can proceed to each of you having a statement, and then a free-for-all, a guided discussion with me throwing questions or little bombs out there, seeing what happens, okay? All right, to my right is Tom Gallagher. As John already said, a professor, an academic, a researcher, a biographer. Have his very well-received, well-reviewed biography of Salazar here. He is Professor Emeritus of Politics at the University of Bradford in the UK. This is not his latest book, though. I recommend you all look for his 2023 book, Europe's Leadership Famine, which is basically a series of profiles of the great and the good. And there's a very important, very illuminating chapter on the Prime Minister of this country. Highly recommended. Then we have Jaime Nogueira Pinto, as John said, editor of Crítica 21, which I think you took over there. But he's also another biographer of Salazar. Here's one edition. There are several. And I think there was an earlier collection of profiles and comments and statements made by people who knew Salazar. He also has books on pandemics through the ages, through the centuries, a book on Islam and the West, and at least two novels that I know of based on his experiences as an editor, as a professor, as an analyst. There's many other things I could say about both these gentlemen. I won't. And finally, John, who you all know and who we all love. John, should I reintroduce you? I don't think there's any need, but let me just say that I'm in the presence here of three great men I've admired, and men that I'm blessed to call friends today. So with nothing further, we'll proceed. We'll give Tom the floor. You can speak from there or use the lectern as you like, and then we'll go to Jaime. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mario, for being very determined to get this event off the ground. You managed to pull it off, and for John, Melissa, and the Danube Institute for hosting this. I happen to be in Portugal for a fortnight until Sunday, and I must say that the way that you described the revolution, its impact, wasn't really reflected on the ground. If you visited some provincial libraries, you would see exhibitions for the revolution. I remember one where there were various murals, for instance. It was impossible for young people to kiss before the 25th of April in public, emphasizing just how retrograde and oppressive the system occasionally was. But on the streets, overhearing conversations in the run-up to the anniversary, the revolution was hardly mentioned, or it was just mentioned, oh, it's a holiday this Thursday. There was a melodrama occurring last week that seemed to capture far more attention. That was the fate of the football club for Porto, FC Porto, with the long-running and rather dictatorial chairman of that club, Pinto da Costa, finally be removed in a referendum. And there were plenty of conversations about that. But on the bright side, I think the revolution, the anniversary was carried out with decorum and restraint. It was a moment of pleasure for numerous people who gathered in the centre of Lisbon, mainly on the left. It was quickly over. So without more ado, I will just offer some kind of very quick headlines about what I see as the nature, significance, and long-term impact. Let's not forget that the anniversary occurs as the political left in Portugal, which has been in the ascendant for the last quarter of a century, was consigned to the opposition benches in elections last year. And I think this shows that the miserable performance, especially of the far-left parties, shows there is no appetite for experimentation. This time not economic, as it was in 1975, but focused instead on human nature, which progressives everywhere are tirelessly advocating. It's also easy to forget that the drama and radicalism and staying power of the revolution, the demonstrations with mass attendances going on for month after month, was mainly propped up by radicals from Northern Europe descending on Lisbon during what was a heady but very deceptive time. And today in 2024, many of these radicals occupy positions of power in state and European institutions. And these are the people who those editorials that Mario mentioned were directed at. So the anti-fascist motif was a constant during the revolution. The emergence of the populist conservative Chega party has been viewed as the return of a fascist threat, but more the case outside than inside Portugal. I think its leader, former lawyer, former sports commentator, someone who has done many things in his life, Andre Ventura, is very difficult to characterize as a kind of sinister authoritarian figure. I think one thing that has probably been overlooked in the discussions in Portugal and elsewhere is the relevance of the revolution for today's anti-colonial struggles. It's highly unlikely that much time will be devoted to the innocent losers in the revolutionary process, the Portuguese of different racial backgrounds who had sided with the pre-1974 authorities, had often fought on their side, and who were quickly abandoned by the captains, the Carnation Revolution. I asked Jaime yesterday this question. Did the captains, in their weeks of preparation for the coup, imagine that the overseas territories would be swept away within a period of months? Did they think this scenario was likely to happen? And he said no, that they didn't. And probably they didn't imagine that the white populations, and then also mixed race populations to a large extent of Angola and Mozambique, would have to flee due to the chaos, the inability of the civil and military factions to preserve any kind of peace in the empire. And I've no hesitation in saying that the disappearance of several very promising multiracial societies in Africa was a great calamity in historical terms. Today, agitators are busy trying to subvert democracies in the Northern Hemisphere by stirring up strife on numerous fronts. Portugal has so far been spared serious disruption from bitter and often artificial racial conflicts that mainly affect the Anglo-Saxon countries. And if the independence of the overseas territories had occurred peacefully and gradually without human displacement, then today Portuguese-speaking Africa would perhaps be a model of the triumph of racial harmony over antagonism. And this was a great loss. I would see the role of the military during the revolution as one of a useless vanguard, encouraged by the civilian left, flamboyant officers like Major Otello de Carvalho, projecting themselves as military guardians, as upholders of poder popular, popular power. But this was a sort of dreamy, threadbare affair. And the military radicals eulogized in the revolutionary agitprop that swept Portugal were actually a minority of the armed forces. And bitter power struggles within the civilian left diluted the hopes of idealistic, ambitious, opportunistic soldiers that they could be at the center of a new, exciting epoch in Portugal's history. The incoherence of the military left was cruelly exposed by one episode which I doubt is going to be commemorated in the next 18 months. That was the Campaña de Dinamização Cultural, the cultural dynamization campaign in the countryside, meant to instill radical awareness among the conservative peasantry. And locals resented at being patronized by meddling soldiers, raised their fists at them and told them to get out of their villages, leave them alone. And this raised the first doubts about whether it would be possible for the military to be the vanguard of an audacious social experiment. I wanted to make a remark comparing Spain now, where the situation is increasingly alarming due to the, how shall I call it, sentimental demagoguery of the Prime Minister, up to his neck in apparently serious wrongdoing, with Portugal in 1975, where I think the danger of demagoguery was actually faced up to and challenged. But I don't think I've got time to do that. It might emerge later. One of the main reasons why the revolution failed was because of the fratricidal nature of the far left. The far left, of course, says the revolution was sabotaged from the outside by Western capitalist interests, or, the Social Democrats of Western Europe betrayed the revolution by propping up the socialists, Mario Soares. In fact, I think the intense rivalry and mutual hatreds between an alphabet soup of revolutionary parties, the dogmatism of the Communist Party, doomed, I think, the revolution to some kind of miserable end. Although the end could have occurred in different ways. There was a soft landing. There was a danger of civil war if different military units had received instructions from Cunhal, the Communist Party leader, to hold out. Then Portugal could have witnessed tragic bloodshed. So the watershed in the period between April 1974 and November 75, when the revolution fizzled out, was the elections exactly 1 year after the coup, 25th of April 1975, for a constituent assembly. Civilian and military radicals fretted about this inconvenience when a revolution which had just seen the greatest mass seizure of private property transferred into state hands, farms, businesses, huge enterprises, that an election was going to hold up the glorious revolutionary journey. But the desire for free elections after so many years when they were absent was too great to halt. After all, liberty was the word which had come to sum up the promise, the purity of the revolution. And over 90% of people turned out to vote. The supposedly backward, easily manipulable Portuguese. Today, in recent elections, the turnout has been 40%, 45%, which says little about the health of democracy. But those 90% of people overwhelmingly backed pluralist parties. Communists and their allies only got 16. And this encouraged people to fight against the seizure of the media by the communists, the takeover of the trade unions, and you had a turbulent period in the summer of 1975, the Veralkent, the hot summer. So I would just sum up with the following thoughts. The revolution didn't have a strong ideological imprint on society. Portuguese are still quietly proud, and I doubt if this came out in any of the English language coverage of the revolution, of their overseas role, Christianizing, developing new markets, their imperial role. They acknowledge the terrible crimes of slavery, but they don't beat themselves up about it. They see that the human being is a multifaceted, contradictory individual. In 1980s, Portugal finally enjoyed some good economic fortune. There were a lot of new infrastructure projects. They were rarely named after revolutionary symbols. By now, a centre-right government was in office. The second Lisbon Bridge was named after Vasco da Gama. The motorway spanning the Algarve was named after Henry the Navigator. And so Portugal's overseas role has actually been quietly commemorated by all of the regimes, despite their normal rivalries. And the event which overshadowed the celebrations last week, and we were talking about it, was, I think, the very unwise decision of the flamboyant president of Portugal, Marcelo Rebelo de Sousa, to call to say that he thought Portugal should pay reparations to Brazil for slavery. And this took the attention away from the revolution very quickly, and he has been denounced from almost all sides. So I think it's no small matter that Portugal currently seems able to handle its past quite well, while stronger European nations are tearing themselves apart over exaggerated disputes over different aspects. So in wrapping a melodramatic anniversary around, I would say, bland, inoffensive sentiments, Portugal has displayed a pragmatic outlook, while divided countries like Britain and Spain, I think, would do well to observe and learn from the Portuguese example as they battle their own historical demons. Thank you.
Thank you, Tom. I believe it's on.
Is it on? No, yes. Yes, it's on. Well, good afternoon, and thank you to John. Thank you for hosting this very interesting discussion. I must say that as Mario Fantini has already said, I was a little bit nervous to spend the 50th anniversary there, so I came for a meeting in Luxembourg where I discussed with an old communist friend, my generation. We discussed for the Portuguese community in Luxembourg, the Portuguese Revolution, and I came here also to, in a very civilized ambience, to discuss that revolution. First of all, I would like to emphasize something. People of my generation, we were born after the Second World War, we were not supporters of the regime, the authoritarian regime that was ended by the revolution in 50 years ago. But we were supporters of an idea of Portugal and a reality of Portugal that was this multiracial empire that we were, in some sense, keeping going after the most part of the strong colonial empires of the West have failed. Because Salazar thought that Portugal, without these empires, what we called at the time overseas provinces, or you can, for the rest of the conversation, call it colonies, even if I'm critical of colonies idea. But without that, we will lost our independence. That was the main reason. And maybe late, we were doing an effort, and the last years of the Estado Novo were in economic terms, as recently some economic historians have reestablished the truth, were extraordinary in terms of the development of the economy. I must say that were the only years where Portugal, in some sense, converged with most developed economies in Europe. This is a fact. It's not. It's numbers. It's facts. Distribution is another thing, but I don't believe that distribution nowadays is very fair in Portugal. So we had a lot of people immigrating nowadays, and the people who immigrate nowadays is the qualified people that came for better jobs in Europe. That is important. Second point I would like to emphasize is that all this problem with the captains was born by a corporate reason. They were unhappy with the problem of the war, and nowadays I understand, to make war, this kind of wars, colonial wars, let's call it, without a professional army is very complicated. You know, the Americans have the problem in Vietnam with that, and the successful cases of this kind of wars were the British in Kenya and in Malaysia, but at the end of the day finished with controlling militarily, but giving at the end of the day giving also the independence. And we had that problem. The problem was solved. In Angola, there was no war. I served in Angola in the last years, in the last time. There was no war at all. In a contingent of 80,000 people, we had, in 73, we had 52 casualties. More than half of them were accidents and that sort of thing. And people died. People died sometimes, died for natural causes when they are serving in the military. So there was no war. The serious problem was Guinea, nowadays Guinea-Bissau, that was really has nothing to do with the Angola and Mozambique, and Cape Verde that was completely in peace, or Timor that was also in peace. So the problem all these military conspirators came from Guinea-Bissau. And of course, that the government was very unable to deal with this crisis in the military. And amazing as nowadays it is, the government of Professor Marcel Caetano was obsessed with the extreme right. They were obsessed and saying that maybe the generals, the extreme right generals, will do a coup, a military coup. So they proceed to divide the generals, because when you have a military coup from captains, it means that hierarchy does not work anymore. General Spindler was called as a kind of chaperone for the revolution. As in 26, in the other revolution, that was the one of that installed the military dictatorship that after was done with Salazar. Also, a general was called, because it was also a conspiracy on the revolution of captains and lieutenants. So normally you need a general to give some respectability to the revolution. And what happened, and is normal, what happened after so many years of an authoritarian regime from the right was that you have a cycle from the left. Is normal. It's not very strange. But I would like to emphasize one point. Speaking of the 50th anniversary of the revolution as the instauration of a liberal democracy is not correct. Because until the 25th of November, or even until the Constitution of 76, there was a kind of erratic military dictatorship, in the sense that military arrest on the right and arrest on the left at their will. Ones arrest others, and they arrest the different ones. But that was happening, and I think that we must correct that. And another point is that Tom Gallagher was emphasizing the protagonism of the military. They stay in power officially. They have a kind of tutorial, the Council of Revolution, that was only finished after 82. So that is important, because also, let me tell you something that is true, and you can verify. 6 months after the coup of 25th April, there were more political prisoners in Portugal than in the 24 April. 24 April, there were about 100. After, in 28 of September 74, they arrested a lot of people. They went to arrest me, but I was in Angola, in the north of Angola, so I was able to pass to South Africa at the time. Another point that is very interesting and important is that, in some sense, the hand of empires or colonial, or what was still existing in Southern Africa of white domination, started exactly with the end of the Portuguese overseas empire. Because after Rhodesia was, as you know, in 4 or 6 years was over, and South Africa in 1994 abolished apartheid, and nowadays, but that was good, of course, abolished apartheid, but things, in some sense, the white Africa was finished at that time. And the captains, of course, did not care nothing about that. I don't think they were much more worried at the time with their problems, their corporate problems than others. But after, of course, the left wing is normal that the left wing was in the opposition and they were able to control and to influence and control progressively the military. That was not very difficult to do it, even if the most part of the officers' corps was conservative and on the right. And once these two dates are very interesting. The 11 November is the independence of Angola, so the end of the empire or the colonial domination of Portugal. And in 25th, 2 weeks late, is the end of the revolution. Is the Thermidor, is the counter-revolution, if you want to call it that way. And the Communist Party at that time had played by the rules of Moscow, because, of course, the former American ambassador Carlucci, in his memoirs, he says that in the summer of '75, the Soviet ambassador, Russian ambassador in Lisbon, came to see him, saying that we are not going to make any alteration to Yalta rules. And of course, for the Portuguese Communist Party was very, very, very obedient to Moscow. Dr. Cunhal was one of the last faithful to Moscow. And I didn't say that the communists, the common militant communists, did not want to take power, but leadership did not want. And the resistance, in great part, popular resistance, because in the spring of '75, people by the north, coming by the north of Portugal to the south, start burning their centers of work and their sieges in Portugal. So there was a great resistance coming from a part of the Catholic Church and also from the right wing. So all that, of course, Dr. Cunhal, the communist leader, in the summer of '75, he had a meeting that nowadays we know about it, it's public. He said that we are not going to civil war because we will lose civil war. He was not stupid. Of course, people say, no, but he avoided civil war. Of course, because he was going to lose it. He knows very well that he was going to lose it. Even if they take power for some time in Lisbon, they have a great resistance because politics work in this sense. You define your friend and your enemy, basically your principal enemy, and in that sense, politics is plastic and it changes. And of course, Dr. Soares, that until one moment was with the communists and with decolonization, that sort of thing. When he saw that he will be the next one, of course, he fight against communists because he understood that after taking care of the right and of the center right and of the other parties, they will go after him. And he knew relatively well. I know that he was very impressed. He was in his early days, he was a member of the Communist Party, but he was very impressed by what happened in Prague in '48. I know from a later friend of mine that was with him at the time, and he was very, very impressed these days of '48. He was very impressed seeing what the communists were doing and getting rid of any kind of factionalism, as they say. So I think I underlined several points that I think are not very noticed because we enter a kind of nice narrative. For example, a revolution without blood, civil wars in Angola and Mozambique during a lot of years, had hundreds of thousands of people dying, directly and indirectly. Of course, in Portugal there was. Because also, and just to finish, this point is very important. We are a very old nation. And in an old nation, last civil war we had was 200 years ago. Classic war between liberals and traditionalists. But in an old nation, people know each other, people have the family links, people have neighborhoods, all. And so that human factor of an old nation also, I think, counted a lot for avoiding worse things. Thank you.
Thank you, Jaime.
Well, thank you very much. Well, I should begin with an audience warning that my remarks may, to some degree, repeat what has been said by the other speakers, because my opinions have been very often formed in conversation and in their works, their books. I also was struck, was influenced by a remark made by a friend of mine, a Portuguese academic, very much involved in politics, a man of the original, a man who is in a sense a man of the center, sometimes left, sometimes right, but who at the time of the revolution was a Maoist. And I said to him, this is a bit of a surprise to learn you're a Maoist, and it doesn't seem to be the kind of chap you are. And he said, John, you have no idea of how boring the Salazar years were. And therefore I think that's one of the factors which I'd like to highlight, because I think it explains in part the festive character of the revolution, people being able to express their views strongly and in a way happily. And secondly, it explains much of what happened, both the myth and the reality later of the course of the revolution. One of those, something that produced that, I want to make 6 points briefly. One is, what produced that? Well, to some degree, what produced it was the ambiguous but respectable reputation of Salazar and the Salazar government in the West for most post-Cold War years. People knew Salazar, despite formal Portuguese neutrality, had in effect been neutral on the side of the Allies. This is quite clear, and it stemmed from a request to him by Churchill not to live up to the long alliance with Britain, but actually to remain neutral, because Churchill did not want Hitler to invade the Iberian Peninsula, and he asked Salazar if Hitler would, if he would appeal to Franco to remain neutral, which he did, as far as we know, and I would say that was, and in Tom's book particularly, I think the membership. Portugal's membership of NATO was reflected in the fact that the ambassadors in Lisbon treat Portugal as a valuable and important ally. Yes, it was authoritarian. It wasn't a democracy, but it wasn't a totalitarian power or had any sympathy with totalitarianism either. And for that reason, Portugal had a slightly different reputation to Spain during this period. And that's important both as a restraint on Portuguese actions and as a and produces a willingness to deal with Portugal in a sympathetic way as possible. The second point I would want to make is, of course, already made partly, is this was an important, the Carnation Revolution had an impact on global events even more than it did on domestic Portuguese events. The so to speak, quote, liberation, unquote, of the Portuguese Empire meant that a building block preventing the ready expansion, collapse of white power and the ready expansion of countries sympathetic to a left attitude in politics. That obstacle was removed, and it led very quickly, first of all, to the negotiations that produced Zimbabwe out of Rhodesia, and secondly, some years later, to the end of apartheid and the establishment of a multi-ethnic democracy in South Africa. It would be nice if the atmosphere of South African politics remained as it was in the 1990s and later, but it has not. And we have to really remember what Tom just called the innocent victims of the revolution in Africa and elsewhere. It is interesting, however, that relations today between Portugal and its previous imperial possessions are actually very good, and there's a lot of mutual immigration between these two. But for a long time, I think some of the events that happened in Rhodesia, the importation of the North Koreans to basically massacre internal enemies of the Zimbabwe regime, those things would have been less likely if a slower evolution towards multi-ethnic democracy had been allowed to take its course. We can't second guess history. We just know it wasn't allowed to take its course. The next point I'd like to make is the significance of the row between Kissinger, in the charge of the State Department, and between Frank Carlucci, who was essentially a CIA man as well as a diplomat. They differed strongly on what would happen with the revolution. Kissinger was pessimistic. He was inclined to despair, think that this would be another kind of Cuba. Carlucci, who was there, was not. He insisted that there would be, if American and other Western Europeans kept up a friendly pressure, there would not be a communist revolution and the establishment of an anti-Western regime, and he turned out to be correct. I'm an admirer, I know not many people are not, but I'm an admirer of Dr. Kissinger. But I do think that this was an example of how large ideological visions of world politics have to be supplemented by knowledge of what is going on the ground. You can't, if you're a Secretary of State, particularly at the time Kissinger was, you can't avoid putting things in the big picture. But it was absolutely essential that Carlucci was there, because he ensured that there would be no second Cuba in the Iberian Peninsula. By the way, there's a nice tribute to Carlucci in the fact that that the ambassadorial residence in Lisbon today is Casa Carlucci. So that's recognized. And Kissinger himself recognized it later. Another important element in this was the contribution, the intervention, really, of the mainly German political institutes. I forget the name of the socialist one. Sorry? Ebert, that's right, Friedrich Ebert, but Konrad Adenauer for the Christian Democrats, and so on. They intervened to help create and shape modern European political parties. He gave them technical help, they gave them encouragement, they gave them the benefit of diplomatic help from embassies and other things. How crucial that was, well, I'd turn to my colleagues and the ambassador to tell me that. But it was important, and not only for Portugal, because it subsequently became a practice that they applied in Central America, in the El Salvador and Nicaraguan cases, and of course in this part of the world during the late 80s and 89 and 91. That kind of helpful intervention, they had no powers, they couldn't punish, but they could help and they could encourage, and they did that, and they did it effectively. And they formed, only one of the things forming, but they helped to form the basis of the new Portuguese democracy that subsequently has evolved, it seems to me from other people's remarks too, has evolved in a fundamentally fair direction. I mean, that is to say, no one in Portugal at the moment is saying that this election was stolen. I'm right about that, I think. Okay. Finally, this is something which I don't think anyone else has mentioned, but I think is important. The failure from a communist or infantile leftist standpoint of the revolution paved the way to what was a temporary but significant evolution in the communist mindset. Following the way the communists did not wage a civil war, they fought, but they gave in when, as you said, they realized reality would not favor them. European communism developed a new strain which we called Euro-communism. It was mainly the Italians, but it spread. And I can remember conversations in England in the late 70s with conservative members of parliament and with conservative people on the centre left, who took seriously the concept of Euro-communism, this new kind of communism, which wasn't quite fully democratic, but was a movement towards democracy and to be encouraged. Now, I wasn't sure it should be encouraged because, of course, I didn't mind it as a step on the evolution of the left towards the full acceptance of democracy. But I didn't want it to become an alternative to that evolution or a dead end. But it didn't do that, and it didn't do that for the obvious reason that communism collapsed in its heartlands, and that all of these kind of attempts by fundamentally the right and the left to find some middle ground on which they could deal with communists in countries that had very large communist parties, that faded away instantly. Euro-communism blossomed, and then it died within the space of a decade. I think at most 15 years. I think that that's a very significant impact of the Carnation Revolution. And I hope that my colleagues agree that it played an important part. Thank you.
Thank you, John. Well, there are a lot of threads I'd like to pick up on, but I want to go back and help the audience and myself understand a little bit of how this happens. In other words, we're talking about a regime, the longest lasting fascist regime in Europe, that was apparently rotten. I know that's debatable itself, but how does it fall apart? What was going on internally? It was adrift. It was impotent. It had no desire to continue. What makes it so easily to topple? Why is it so weak, Jaime?
Well, first of all, I totally disagree, and I think
I was hoping for that.
Totally disagree with the classification of fascist, because it's not a question of fascists being worse or badly, or not. I'm not speaking about that. Is that it was not really. It was a national conservative authoritarian regime that was based and supported by the military. Salazar came to the power after the military dictatorship because the military were completely unable to deal with the problems of government. So he was a specialist in public finance. He came as a technocrat. He solved the problem of the debt. It was easier. He said to the military, okay, you give me the conditions. Okay, they say. So nobody is going to spend an escudo without my, I agree, with that, my agreement. And with that, he controlled the political class, and after the capitals that have immigrated come back to Portugal, and in some sense, also the fact that the First Republic was extremely Jacobin and went after the Catholic Church and the priests and all the 25th April Revolution was the first time in a modern revolution that they did not kill priests. They normally killed priests in Portugal. It was in the day of the revolution, and they normally push out the Jesuits. It was a kind of ritual, always happened. And no, in that sense, we have to say that 25th April, they haven't killed priests. Well, so Salazar ruled, supported by the army and the church also, but the army above all. And in some sense, the problem with Salazar regime was that he made a regime that was only, in my opinion, is controversial, of course, but it was only worked with him. It was so long that in some sense it worked with him, and when his successor came, it was Marcelo Caetano. It was a disaster because Salazar was someone who decided things. He decided. It was and Marcelo Caetano was very intelligent, but he was a kind of a Hamlet. You see, in a country where power is so concentrated in the head of government, to have someone that is difficult to take decisions and rationally looks for arguments, one side and the other, it was a disaster. It was a disaster in that sense. But, well, and an interesting point is that this decay of the regime was in the late 50s, was already very, very evident. But the war in Africa, in some sense, gave some years of relief and popularity to the regime, because there was a lot of patriots even in the opposition. The classic opposition in Portugal was completely pro-overseas and the empire that is very important in tradition of Portugal. And lots of these Republican leaders in 1961, they said that they, of course, they were against the regime, but they supported policy of Salazar in Africa. The first person that in opposition that said that Portugal had to get the colonies was Dr. Mário Soares in 1965. Was the first politician that said that. So, in some sense, answering your question, it was the war of Africa that, curiously enough, first of all, gave some relief and some more time to the regime that otherwise will not. Of course, we survived, as John was underlining. We were saved by the Cold War. It's the problem after the Second World War. The moment Communist Russia became the principal enemy, of course, the United States and all the democratic countries in Europe supported dictatorships, right-wing dictatorships. Even sometimes they promoted them through military coup and other things. So Communist Russia became the principal enemy. And as John was saying, the ambassadors, Western ambassadors in British and Americans in Portugal said, if Salazar falls down, the regime, the communists are the only one in the opposition that will be able to take over. So people were very, very careful to deal with that.
Tom or John?
Well, in order to give the audience a chance to come in with questions, I'll just be very brief. I mean, I think the regime's foundations were quite solid. If Salazar had had enough confidence in the ability of the people to reject Jacobin, career-minded, disruptive politicians, the likelihood is that in the 50s, early 60s, Portugal would have evolved in the direction of Gaullist France. In the final years of the regime, there was not massive dissatisfaction. A couple of weeks before the coup, without any organization, Marcelo Caetano turned up at a football match and was wildly applauded by the mainly working class supporters there. The Achilles heel, leaving aside Africa, etc., of the regime was that it was one without politics. It had no means of self-defense when an unexpected challenge arose.
So then it crumbles when this arises.
Could I raise a question addressed to either or both of my colleagues here? Salazar was an economist. My general impression of his years was that the escudo was rock solid and riding high, but that this was a considerable cost in economic growth and the development of the economy, so that the country didn't keep rise with the rising prosperity of the surrounding countries. Is that correct?
Well, I think one of the sources of stability of the regime was that economically it was very calm. There was no inflation. So salaries kept their value. And the escudo was one of the strongest currencies in Europe. And the development was, let's not forget, that when Salazar arrived on the scene, Portugal, in terms of social conditions, essentially was a third world country. There was no other European country approaching it in terms of depressed living standards. And there was growth through each of the decades, interrupted by the Second World War. So the modernity of Portugal arose from the dictatorship. I would dispute the claims of many on the left that the dictatorship stifled modernity. So the economy was in a strong position up to 1974. There were structural problems, a decade of stagnation, another decade, 15 years of growth, and we've had a quarter of a century of stagnation.
Thank you.
No, and also another point I think is very important also, is that in terms of repression, in terms of victims, for example, that has nothing to do with the other dictatorships, because in the 48 years, military dictatorship between 26 and 33, and after 33 to 74, Estado Novo working, the people who died in custody or were in, I mean in Portugal, European Portugal. I'm not speaking about the colonies and the wars in colonies. This is another issue. But the people who died in custody were 64 people. Well, it makes, I think, in terms of communist experiences, even in this country, or speaking of other dictatorships on the right or German Nazism and that sort of thing, has nothing to do. And for example, now they say that there were a lot of books that were, I read all these books that they say that were forbidden. I read them, I bought them, I read them at that time. They now publish saying it was forbidden. No, even the change in uses, for example, this thing that Tom Gallagher was speaking about, they said a campaign that was não podias, you could not. And they say stupid things. For example, that you could not go and to give kisses. It's not, I think, a man and a woman, of course. I'm speaking about that, not other things. That was they said, for example, that miniskirts could not be used. I remember all my later times in the 60s, every young girls used miniskirts. They said that there was not allowed bikini in the. It's completely false. That is anyone who lives in that times knows that is complete. The great change in the uses of people was in the second half of the 60s. I think everywhere was that, not only in Portugal. It has nothing to do with politics.
John, you're about to say something, because otherwise, let me just add this. I think you're right. I think there's a whole series of articles and books that have been written over the decades revising the history, revisionist history. And I was just reading some accounts from the Socialist Worker, don't hold it against me, paying tribute to the revolution, and they were listing all the things that were now allowed, and they include the miniskirts and the books, and they also claim that all these murders took place, thousands, but it's not held up when you look at the facts by the historians and the others who really looked at the numbers. So I think that the Socialist Worker and other outlets like that, other organs, have been immensely successful at pushing a kind of black legend about Portugal during the Salazar years. John?
Well, I was just going to say two quick things. One is, how I may look, you are fighting a hopeless battle against the expansion of the word fascism to mean something not desirable, which Orwell pointed out as early as the 1940s. Of course, you're absolutely right. Fascism is the doctrine, a political doctrine of a particular party in one of several countries in the 30s. It's an interesting doctrine, I think a bad one, but the point is it's something individual and different. Fascism, as it is used in everyday political rhetoric now, particularly on the left, but more generally, is just used as a swear word against something. And I think, we should point it out, but we're not going to change it. I did have another point, but it wasn't very important, so I'll throw it open to the floor.
Sure, let's, Paul. I'll give you mine.
No, we want to capture your words for posterity.
Thanks, Martin.
Well, thank you for this very interesting presentation. I have two questions. First of all, to John's point about the Western Alliance, my understanding is that the Anglo-Portuguese Treaty, the Treaty of Westminster of 1386, remained in effect all throughout the 20th century, through the Second World War, through the Cold War, and even to the present day. So that agreement and also the wartime agreement to allow American bases in the Azores were an important basis for Portugal's integration into NATO later. And my other question, something I actually don't know very much about, it was the revolutionary regime that recognized the Soviet Union. Portugal and the Soviet Union did not have diplomatic relations from the time of the Russian Revolution until the 70s. What were the Russians doing in Lisbon, if anything, at that time? Because what we know about their activities in Chile in 73 is actually quite damning for the revisionist accounts now. So I just wondered if you had any information that you could share about that.
Well, I think the Russians were very active. They came and but they also used the Communist Party that was very, very, very pro-Russian. Dr. Cunhal was one of the last, and it's very curious because the Portuguese Communist Party survived practically until 5 or 6 years, was the only communist party surviving. The Euro-communists disappeared completely. But they used the front line of the Communist Party. And of course, there was the fragmentation of these groups of Maoists, and a lot of, we have the Maoists, Trotskyists, all the lunatic fringle was present there and very happy to do things. But after they disappeared, and in some sense, they were a fascination for people, I think, in that sense. About the Portuguese, the Anglo-Portuguese, that was really very, very, very important. And during the war, just adding this, during the Second World War, I think Franco and Salazar, in some sense, cooperate in the sense that they did not want war in the peninsula. So Franco, in some sense, covered Salazar on the side of the Axis, and Salazar covered Franco on the side of the Allies. Once I was saying that, and a Portuguese historian said, but look, there's no documents about that. And I said, of course not. With Madrid and Lisbon, plenty of spies. They were going to change letters or saying, no, I'm supporting you. I said, most important things in history have no documents about that.
All I would say about the Anglo-Portuguese alliance is that the British, more than any other nation, I think, are responsible for the bad events that Portugal encountered in the 1970s. Why on earth am I making such a melodramatic claim? Because with Mountbatten in India, the very rapid departure, you then began a cycle of rapid imperial retreat. And Salazar, I think, failed to realize how profoundly the mood in the elite in Britain had shifted, and that the kind of global imperial perspective was no longer the defining one. And Goa, Nehru marching in 1961, Macmillan refusing to offer any support to his oldest ally, finally caused the scales to fall from Salazar's eyes, and talking to his friends, and he had very important friends at the top of the power structures in France and Germany, they said that the Britain we used to know no longer exists. So when the Rhodesia crisis came along in 1965, Salazar, far more self-aware about how Britain was going in a very odd direction, decided he would back the white regime of Ian Smith, and in a confrontation with the Prime Minister of that time, Harold Wilson, he actually bested the British, who were unable to prevent the UDI, the white regime, consolidating itself. So I think the British turn away from its long-term sort of imperial role that had lasted 200 years, caused a lot of disruption, and in many ways shaped what we are talking about today.
Other questions from the audience? I see two people here.
Hi there. I was interested about the diplomatic relations between Portugal and Mozambique and Angola in the modern world, but more specifically how Portugal has dealt with a country like, say, Malawi, which was very heavily affected by the war from Mozambique in terms of refugees, etc., and the overflow of weapons, etc. So kind of broadly diplomatic relations with Southern Africa, I suppose. Thank you.
Well, I followed that very, very closely all the time after the independence. And one thing economically, at one moment, the relationship was better than now. Now we are going through, in some sense, the Portuguese investment, for example, in Angola. We had two serious post-empire problems with these two countries. One was Cabora Bassa in Mozambique. There was a great debt of Cabora Bassa, and there was also the debt of Angola. And those problems were, in some sense, were solved. Of course, in both places, the white communities practically, they fled the country, and that was in some sense the fault of. I think that's something that it's not a joke. I think the Portuguese left was obsessed by Salazar, and they do everything contrary to what they think Salazar would do. So after the revolution, they said, well, these things of colonies, that was an obsession of Salazar. We have nothing to do with that. And really, the communists still were preoccupied with Angola, for example, that the MPLA, that was the party, the brother party of them, will be the one taking power. That the communists take care of it, but until the end of the decolonization. But in other places, they pure left. But the relation, I'd say that nowadays, and I have my own experience with the people on the leadership, both in Angola and Mozambique, in Guinea, and look, these people were nationalists. So in some sense, they understood that a Portuguese nationalist, in some sense, did not want to give them independence. They understand that. They understand that perfectly. So nowadays, as I say, I'm not going to reconquer your countries. Now you are independent. It's a fact of life. I'm not going. So they in that sense, I think that's not a serious problem. But economically, we have to recognize that after a very, very strong 10 years ago, 15 years ago, there was a much more important relationship. Nowadays, economically, I think, but culturally and politically, above all with Angola. Angola is a different case from the others, because in Angola, the colonization was a colonization of single men and poor men that made families there. If you look, and I used to say, I know quite well Angola, and it's a country, an African country, where a white man is no news. It's not an object of hate, not an object of veneration. It's common, it's normal. People, even small children in the middle of the country, they will not be surprised to see a white man. For example, in Mozambique, they were. I spent some time in North Mozambique, and people come to see a white man. In Angola, it's no news.
There were two more. Gentlemen here.
Hello. In the United States, at the time of Vietnam War, you had drafting of young men, and then there was the anti-war sentiment, demonstrations, etc. Was there any role in this Carnation Revolution of the young men who didn't wish? Were they drafted the same way in Portugal? Would they have to go to the colonial war?
Yes.
And did this play any role in the revolution, or they just simply left the country?
Nowadays, people say that play a very important role. But I will tell you, there were objectors of conscience, people who did not want, by political reasons, and there was an immigration of, I'd say, middle-class cadres, some people that they did not want to go to the war by political reasons. I was a contrary. I went for political reasons as a volunteer. I must be the last volunteer because there were very, very few ones. So I think as I decided to go 2 months before the 25th April Revolution. But the most part of people, they do the service. I say the common people, the soldiers, there was not really. There was of course a great migration to Europe, but the most part of people was by economic reasons, was not objectors of conscience, as it happened mainly in the United States, mainly in universities, not with the workers, no, was not with the blue collars. Blue collars normally are more patriotic than the elites.
Yeah, okay. I understand that around the same time, maybe even the following year, Franco fell too, and it was just next door to Portugal. I guess the difference is that the Generalissimo simply died rather than got thrown out. So my question to the panel is, what are some of the similarities and differences between the Salazar regime and that of Franco's?
I think Spain had a longer list of problems that would have impeded democratic consolidation than Portugal. Territorial problems stand out. And it's interesting that the Portuguese constitution forbids any separatist political party. So the various parties in Spain would be outlawed. The ones that are cooperating very closely with the Sanchez government, minority government, helping to maintain it in power, and this obviously is the case with the separatists in Britain. Also, Spain had had a recent civil war, and the wounds were still fairly fresh. I would say that one of the reasons why the Portuguese Revolution saw relatively little loss of life was because of the calm experiences of the Salazar dictatorship. I mean, Portugal was a very safe country. There wasn't a lot of crime, there wasn't terrorism, and the various organs of government, the justice system was not controlled by the regime. Judges were not appointed by the regime. The regime did not, as in fascist countries, have a large political paraphernalia. So people complained about the system, but they didn't actively resent it or hate it. A very interesting book was published about the secret police. A Portuguese scholar had gone through the archives, and he had discovered lots of everyday citizens who were complaining to the PIDE about injustices and hoping that this dreaded, sinister organization would somehow intervene and put things right again. So the PIDE was seen by some ordinary people as a kind of ombudsman. I don't know what the term is outside the English-speaking world, as a kind of impartial referee. If I may, I'm going to very briefly make a comparison between Portugal in 1975, the difficult origins of democracy, when demagoguery was face down, what was defeated, and the unhappy situation in Spain now, where it is rampant.
Tom, please use the microphone for the...
Yeah, all right, I will. And all I'm going to do is quote an editorial that I read this morning in a very good online Spanish publication, The Objective, by a commentator, George Vilches. And he wrote about the tolerance of the ruling party, the Socialist Party, one that has a long tradition in Spain for upholding constitutionalism, and which played a key role in the transition after Franco, when many people doubted that there would be enough common ground for democracy to take root. So this is what Vilches wrote. The populist absurdity of these 5 days. Last Thursday, Sanchez said, I may well decide to quit because of the persecution of the media and the justice system directed at my wife. The populist of absurdity of these 5 days has exposed an organization that is not comparable with the European governing parties, with those organizations that built democracies in a desolate continent in the second half of the 20th century. The permissiveness that socialists in Spain have towards a politician who has eliminated internal debate, competition, rival personalities in each of the Spanish territories, the circulation of elites is as astonishing as it is degrading. The cult of the leader, the replacement of rationality or disagreement with Sanchez's will shows us a party very far from European democratic customs and very close to Ibero-American, that is Latin American, populist ways. I'll just end with this remark. This is the scenario that many people thought would quickly arise in Spain after Franco's death, that you would have demagogues who would just run rampant, and the chaos, the strife that led to military intervention in 1936 would soon overwhelm Spain again. But for 50 years, Spain avoided this polarization, but now it looks as if it is going to face some very hard times.
Well, going to compare the two, starting by the personalities. Franco was, above all, a great military commander. He was a general, I think, with 29 years. He made all the campaigns of Morocco, and he was extremely successful. And Salazar, I think, never made military service, nothing at all. Was a completely, in that sense, was the classic technocrat, or he was very influenced. He had two influences, I'd say, intellectual and doctrinal influences. On one side, the rationalism of Charles Maurras and Action Française. On the other side, the so-called social popes, the Leo XIII and all the social Catholic, the Catholic social. That is a very interesting third way in 19th century. So he was the product of these two things. After he came, when the military gave him power, Franco had a war, a 3 years war, a very tough war, terrible war, with both sides making a lot of very bad things, really eliminating on one side and the other. So he came after this civil war. Curiously enough, in Spain, as we have mentioned, Spain is a plurinational state because Catalonia and Basque Country, and in some sense, it's a revival. The separatism is a revival of late 19th century. There was not nowadays separatist movements say, no, we came from, no. Also, by economic reasons also were very important, because in 19th century, both the Catalan bourgeoisie and the industrials of the Basque Country were very interested in the protectionism of Spain, because they sold all their products in Spain and they have no competition from outside. That changed with Europe, and both separatisms, both the Catalan and the Basque nationalism were coming from bourgeoisie, not coming really from. Of course, they have some support on I'd say nowadays with average people, but above all, they were So it's completely different. I used to say, as a kind of joke, comparing I used to say that Salazar will never have reason, and Franco will always have reason in reporting the succession. I said Salazar because if Marcelo Caetano, the successor of Salazar, was able to continue, people will say, Marcelo Caetano was extraordinary. He take this old authoritarian or dictatorship of Salazar, and he was able to liberalize, and so he was a success. What happened, people said, well, Salazar, it was his fault because he left his Caetano take power after him. On the contrary, Franco will always be right, because if there was the military and there was the king. If at one moment Franco, things have gone, and they were very terrible because ETA killed around 1,000 people after the transition. ETA killed a lot of people in Spain. And several times the military were to move. They haven't moved. So people will say, now they will not say because things are getting, but in the beginning people say, no, Franco was extraordinary because the king, it worked with the king, and if the military had intervened, said Franco was right because he had this safety net of the military and they intervened. So it's a kind of joke, but in some sense jokes sometimes are real. Thank you.
I think I would say that one of the interesting aspects of the changes to democracy is the degree to which personal qualities of the leaders counted. In the case of Spain, I think most people knew that the leading figures at the top of the Spanish government at the time of Franco's death wanted to move towards democracy. They were already halfway there, and Spain had been a reforming government as early as 1958, when Franco scrapped all of the kind of fascist, protectionist elements of society, and Spain boomed thereafter. But I was very struck by Felipe González when he spoke at the Labour conference in Britain in I think it was 76, and he said there have been a series of kind of outrage left-wing speeches from people who were Labour ministers, Judith Hart, and people like that, and they were in effect, almost calling for military intervention, get rid of Franco, and so on. Absurd. And Felipe González stood up and he said, look, you do not indulge in this kind of radical incitement, because, I can't remember his exact words, of course, after all these years, but he said, the people at the top of Franco's regime are moving to democracy, and they want to move further, and we will be able to work with them. He basically said that. And that was a brave thing for him to say, I think, in the context of Spanish politics. It was even a brave thing to say in the context of a Labour conference, and maybe more so at that time. But that was very important. You might say, I think, that in a way, the Spanish leaders behaved like the Portuguese in their moderation and reasonableness at that time. And I think that was important. What is important now in Spain, contrasting again here, is that the socialist government, which is a corrupt one and reliant, as Tom has already established, on people who are not friends of Spain in any sense at all, what they are also doing is attempting to make the expression of views to the not very far to the right of themselves, untenable, unrespectable in Spanish political life. And that's very dangerous. And I think we should really be realistic about the temptations in socialist parties in a general way. Because if you look at this origins of the Spanish Civil War, the 1934 election was stolen by the left. And they were essentially an illegitimate government. But they behaved as though they'd just been elected in a landslide to actually get rid of any form of conservatism in Spain. That one of the major things that was done by that government was to actually murder the leader of the opposition, Cal Bacetello. And that is a crime which, if it had been a conservative government doing it to a socialist leader, the world would know that man's name, which I have just forgotten, and it is absolutely shameful that we never hold them to their historical claims, because if we did, they would be a great deal more cautious about pursuing their political objectives.
Absolutely. A question from Mr. Ambassador.
Thank you very much, and congratulations on this panel. It's been most interesting. I don't have a question. I just want to pick up on what you've been just saying about fascism and the label that is being used. I mean, if this conference was happening in Lisbon, there would probably be people up there shouting against these fascists. I mean, Jaime is already a fascist in Portugal, so that's no problem. But I think that both Salazar and Cunhal needed each other. Salazar needed communism to promote his way, and Cunhal needed the fascist government to oppose. Today is actually a sad day in these last 50 years. It's 50 years today that Cunhal arrived in Lisbon and precipitated all the events. But just two curious facts about what you were discussing, the brutality or not of the regime. Cunhal once was in prison in the 40s, I think, and they let him go to the university to deliver his thesis, his university thesis, which was actually on a theme quite unusual for the time, on abortion. And the second curious fact has to do actually with Hungary. We had two diplomats here in 1944, ordered by Salazar to help Hungarian Jews escape the Holocaust. For instance, the family of Zsa Gabor and Eva Gabor, the actresses, they went to the United States via Lisbon. So it's these, I mean, I celebrate the 25th of April because I'm happy that the regime fell. But there's a lot of things not to celebrate from that day onwards. And I think that you touched on a lot of them. Thank you.
Thank you. We have a few more minutes. I think it would be useful and interesting if we ended this discussion with just a look at what you brought up earlier, Chega, and how Chega grapples with the history of Salazar and what we might expect from Chega. Chega, as most of you may know, has been getting more and more popular and been growing with its support. And I want to say one thing before I turn it over to all of you to opine on Chega and its prospects. I had a conversation a few months ago with people from Vox, and I was trying to get from them a sense of how they view Chega in Portugal. Vox, as you may not know, has a very, even though there's some factions and they've purged a few people out of there, has a very tight nucleus, very intellectual people. Thank you. I will do that. So Chega, which means basta, which means enough, with an exclamation point, is I categorize them as populist, conservative, emerging party in Portugal, led by André Ventura, mentioned by Professor Gallagher earlier. And Vox is its analog in Spain, led by the charming and charismatic Santiago Abascal. For me, what Vox does is impressive. They're very professional. They have an excellent media team. They have a tight group around Santiago Abascal that provides them with great ideas. But I haven't gotten the sense that Andre Ventura is surrounded by similar people. So I brought this up with people from Vox, and they said the problem is a lot of the good right-wing conservative intellectuals are not in Portugal right now, and they're not advising Andre Ventura, and he needs to replicate what Vox has in Madrid. What do you think about that? Is that accurate? And how can we help Chega? And what can we expect in June?
Well, I'll leave the second part of your question to Jaime, but in relation to Ventura and how he views Salazar, Ventura has been critical of Salazar's austerity, his aversion to development, and his phobia about free elections. But he hasn't gone in an exaggerated way against Salazar. He has praised him as someone who had a good governing ethic, who didn't steal from the system, and who, wasn't a megalomaniac, and who died poor. So there isn't, I think within about a few months after the 25th of April, the obsession with Salazar quickly faded, and he became a kind of figure like Bismarck or Henry VIII, someone who had overshadowed the country, but wasn't a kind of villainous demigod as others like Ceausescu or Stalin were. So much as the left would like to, prolong the myth of the diabolical Salazar, most Portuguese don't buy it. I think before Jaime has to say, I would just say that Chega will go places or else it will crumple and break up, depending on the quality of its leadership, its structure, its offer to the population, not by the way it handles the history of Portugal.
What do you think, Jaime?
Well, when André Ventura started Chega, he wanted to speak with me, and I told him very frankly that, if I would have the qualities and the non-qualities for partisan partisan politics, maybe I would create a party myself. So, but I said to him that I think you are very positive in terms. Your intervention will be positive in the sense that the political axis in Portugal is very, very, very on the left, and so you will help to balance it. So I'll help you. I remember, on purpose of Salazar, that once he said in an interview or something, he said that Salazar had made Portugal to go back. I said, nobody, not even left-wing economists say that, please. Okay, so I think now he's more careful on that because he understands. And I remember that Salazar gained this greatest Portuguese competition 15 years ago.
That was a poll, right, among the population, right?
Yeah, he gained that competition anyway. It was between him and Cunhal. It was but he gained by practically half of the votes. So Chega, I agree with one point that Mario Fantini was saying. Chega is better qualified in terms of high middle cards in terms of better than because in Portugal, I'd say that's a serious divorce between, well, some of the, I'd say, the intellectuals on the right, conservative right, and partisan politics. I think that is a fact. But and Chega has that problem. But my point is that political success, in some sense, is not depending on the quality, on the intellectual quality of the people. Otherwise, you and in some sense also, I think that today, maybe the average people are better than the elites. Yes. I think so. I confess that in that sense, I made some, how the communists say, some autocritica, self-criticism. I think it's self-criticism because looking at what is happening in Europe, in all Europe, I think people, in some sense, average people, I mean the voters, the electors, are better nowadays than most part of the elites, because the elites are more globalist, are more internationalist, don't care about other people. They have ideas, kind of, in some sense, stupid ideas about humanity and about what is a nation and about. So, in some sense, maybe the people is better than the elites.
Well, look,
yeah,
sorry.
Who's quicker? Just, I'll be very short. No, you go, John. Go on.
Okay, I will be short. A very good example is Sir Keir Starmer, who is on the line, ought to be almost certain to be the next Prime Minister. At the height, 2 years ago, of critical race theory, statue toppling, and gender theory, he went down on his knees to pledge allegiance to Black Lives Matter, and he also expressed the view that a man could become a woman. Now, those ideas were the reigning passions of the, we call them the elites, but it's an absurd thing, really, the leading numbers of certain kinds of professions. They could not be believed by, as George Orwell said about a remark he'd heard in the 1940s in a pub, that the remark was, the Americans are not here to fight the Germans, they're here to prevent an English revolution. And he said, no ordinary man could say such a stupid thing. You need to be an intellectual to say things like that. And I think you need to be a Labour, a socialist intellectual to believe that a man can be a woman. I forget what the other one was, but it doesn't matter because they all come into the category of nonsensical things which ordinary people instinctively sense are bogus.
Just very quick, the point that I was going to make is that the prospects of conservatism in Portugal are bright. I think Ventura will have to make a lot of mistakes if he is going to be reduced to irrelevance and peripheral status. Why do I say that? Because the quality of the staff, the leadership in all of the parties, established parties in Portugal is, as you have pointed out, abysmal.
Thank you, Tom. Thank you, John. Thank you, Jaime. One final minute, just to say that what emerged in the final minutes of this great discussion, wide-ranging discussion, is for me the most important aspect. The fact that the struggle we're all in today is precisely what Jaime and John and Tom have illuminated or illustrated or talked about. That is that it's the common people against these corrupt ruling elites. And it brings us back to one of my heroes and one of John's former employers, William F. Buckley, who said it 60 years ago, that he'd rather be ruled by the first 2,000 names in the Boston telephone book than by the faculty of Harvard. I think it's a great way to end. Thank you. A round of applause.